I'm going to do a little bit of my spiel, and then we're going to go into talking all about expectations and maintaining the mental load and what this looks like within our relationships, within our interpersonal beings, within intrinsic boundaries with ourselves. We're going to talk about all kinds of different things. And I'm going to be really, really, really honest and upfront with you. This is a really big topic that I could probably build a course on. And the more I was getting different types of questions and different things coming at me, the more I realized there's so many elements to it. So instead of focusing completely on the foundations and the education, I'm going to focus a lot more on storytelling and the interpersonal factors so that you guys can walk away feeling like you have something rather than just like, I just now understand what expectations are and this is what I should do. I want you to have something really, really tangible to walk away with. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm so glad that you're here. For those of you that don't know me or that are new here, my name is Nichole Coyne. I am a licensed psychotherapist in the state of Florida. I own a group therapy practice in Florida. I am also a coach and consultant for high achievers and perfectionists to help you start living in your life rather than running through it. I help with imposter syndrome, high functioning anxiety, perfectionism, and a bunch of other things, and help with really reducing burnout and learning how to manage expectations in a completely new, different way so that you're not feeling overwhelmed and burnt out all the time. So I'm going to break down some of these concepts, and in order to do that, I need to get some definitions, but first a disclaimer because I feel like this is important. So I am a licensed psychotherapist, but I do not work with couples. I am not a couples counselor. I have in the past, and I choose to no longer participate in being a couples counselor. That was real and it was fun, but it wasn't really fun for me. I'm an individual therapist, and I really enjoy that work that I do, but no matter what I'm doing when I'm working with individuals, relationships come up. And we're constantly talking about how we improve relationships with ourselves, with others, romantic relationships. And the reason that I really wanted to do this webinar series throughout the month of February is because I also think that it can be really beneficial for people who are identifying as perfectionists or recovering perfectionists that are working towards becoming recovering perfectionists, learn completely new skills and ways to manage their perfectionism within their personal lives, within their relationships. But I'm not a relationship coach, and I'll be the first one to tell you. I'm also not a relationship couples therapist. So there's my disclaimer for that whole jazz. I am going to use a lot of my personal examples because when I was overcoming and learning how to become a recovering perfectionist, these were the things that I was going through. I've been in a relationship for 11 years. My husband's absolutely amazing. You'll hear all kinds of stories about him tonight. However, we're not perfect. I'm not perfect. There's no such thing. So as much as you're hearing about some of these stories, don't necessarily take everything that you're hearing as this matter of fact, this has to be the way it is, especially if your partner's joining you tonight. Have conversations about this, have discussions, but this is all meant to be built as a foundation for increasing communication so that you guys can improve the way in which you're functioning. Cool. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Amy is assisting me tonight with making sure that I'm going to stay on track with some of the questions. I did get some preliminary questions too that I've added into the presentation because I feel like these are just really, really powerful assets to have immediate questions from you guys. So I'm going to be going through a couple of those as we're chatting, as we're kind of getting and moving along. So before we get into this, there are 3 words that I use pretty commonly that I don't think everybody totally knows the definition to. And it's really important for me to lay these out really early on. Like I said before, I'm not going to do a ton of foundational work as much as I'm going to do a lot more interpersonal, what you can walk away with today. These tips, tricks, skills, things along those lines. But these definitions are really, really important. So I'm going to give you these definitions. The first thing is that this presentation is called Managing Expectations and the Mental Load. What is the mental load, right? What are we talking about when we're talking about the mental load? This is not so much as an old school word as it has been the last like 20 years. The invisible cognitive labor involved with running a household or any responsibilities that relate to how we're managing our lives. So I want you to think of this as how we're cleaning in the house and keeping up with cleaning the house. I want you to think of this as meal prepping. I want you to think of this as making doctor's appointments. I want you to think of this as planning a big family trip, right? Like things along those lines. This is things that are related to the mental load. And the way I really want you to sit with thinking about this when I bring it up is I want you to think about being on a computer and there being a browser window open and there's tabs. And in our minds, whether we're recognizing it or not, we're constantly managing and navigating all these different tabs. How many times have you been working on something and you're like, where's that tab? What did I do with that, right? This is that mental load that we're holding on to. And like we talked about last week with the inner critic, the mental load can be really, really exhausting for perfectionists because we're constantly trying to navigate and understand how many things do I have open, how many things are working, and how many things should I be doing more or less of. When we're in a partnership, the whole goal here is to create some balance between those two. That's not always possible, but a lot of the times, the more balance we can create, the more sustainable it can be for managing some of these expectations, right? So this is why they all flow into each other. The second word is expectations. The beliefs that you hold about the outcome of an event, right? I don't think we break this word down as much as a definition, just like in regular everyday life, but it's the belief that you hold for the outcome of that event, like what you expect, what you believe that that outcome should be. And I think that's really important to pay attention to. Our expectations relate significantly to our earliest attachments. They relate very heavily to the ways in which we attach. And I'm going to go more into detail on this. I actually have a couple really interesting / funny stories that we'll talk about a little bit with this. That could be an entire course and semester. I'm not going to dive too deep in the foundations of it, but I just want you to think about that, right? I want you to think about how you're attached to your partner, how you attach to coworkers and different colleagues, and then what are the expectations that are maintained. I have 2 amazing assistants that work with me, right? And do I have expectations with them? Yes, they have expectations of me. I have expectations of with them. And the longer we're together, the more we start to understand and maintain our attachment to each other, as well as the expectations that we're looking to for that result to come out, to have amazing things like this happen, amazing webinars get put together, right? The third one. So this is my term, and I didn't trademark it or anything, but it's a term that I use pretty often, not something that you'll find in a dictionary somewhere. But the third term I use pretty often, and I'll be saying it a lot tonight, so I think it's really important that we kind of go over it for a second. It's that of creating space. What does this mean? Creating space is about setting internal and external boundaries for your needs when you are feeling overstimulated, overwhelmed, like you've worked way too much, like you're burnt out, right? And one of the things that's really important for partners to understand a lot of the times in relationships is that although we are maintaining a lot with our own self, with our own job, with everything that we're producing, sometimes we have to be able to create that space. And that's really what helps us too with our internal and external boundaries. Just as a side note too, because I keep repeating that and I didn't add that into my definitions of things that I wanted to go through today. Internal boundaries are the boundaries that we set with ourselves. So I want you to think back to the inner critic last week when we were talking about the monger, right? When I was giving you those very actionable skills to say, sometimes it is absolutely okay for you to tell yourself no. It is absolutely okay for you to shut your monger down. Same thing externally, right? Sometimes it is absolutely okay for us to walk away from a situation. Not necessarily when we're in a heated argument with somebody all the times, right? But if we're really overstimulated in a situation and we need to just step out for a few minutes, that's us creating an external boundary. So I hope that gives that good kind of example to understand what the difference is. The internal ones are the ones that we're not going to let our brains think too far ahead, our thought processes. The external ones are the ones that we're like physically making action towards a lot of the times. And even internally, sometimes I'll notice I'm really overwhelmed in a day, or I don't know, something happens and I'm just feeling a certain way. I just need to go take a shower. I just need to set an external boundary physically for an internal need that resets me. That makes sense? So think about that in those different comparisons. In the relation to creating space, this is when we start to allow ourselves an environment to be compassionate and give ourselves grace so that we say, okay, you know what, I'm just going to step away for a few minutes on this. I'm going to create some space. I'm not going to just follow up on that next thing. I'm going to stop for a second. I'm just going to find that boundary. And these are really, really important key elements that I just want to lay out so that as we keep talking about these and I bring these words up, you guys have a little bit of a foundation of what I'm talking about here. Additionally, I got some preliminary questions and I'm really excited about them because they're really, really good. And I want to throw them in here as we're talking. I kind of put them as in like my layout of this presentation. So I'm going to repeat the question that was asked to me, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit. And I kind of inserted them when I think that they're the most relevant. If you have any additional questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat for me. So this one question, and I think I understood where this person was going with this question, but it's pretty subjective in nature. So there may be a different meaning, but what was brought about it. But it was, why is receiving such a hard thing to let in? And what I think that this question was asking was, why is receiving help or aid or support so difficult for perfectionists and with managing our expectations and our mental load, right? A lot of the times when we are experiencing heightened needs related to our mental load, it's very hard for us to always ask for help. And this could be due to the ways in which we've experienced asking for help in the past. It could be due to the ways that we are attached to other people. It could be due to fear of being disappointed, right? That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to give a different example though. One of my favorite hobbies is home projects and interior design. I would never let somebody do the interior design of my house. I wouldn't. Even if they're the best interior designer in the world. The reason being is not because I'm a picky perfectionist who doesn't want them to do the interior design, right? It's not because I don't want to pay for it. It's because I want to be in this environment with something I have created, right? And it would be really hard for me to receive that kind of help, to feel like I'm getting the result that I want, right? It would be hard for me to look at something and be like, yes, I paid somebody to do that. That is not something that I feel I could receive help for. When we're asking why it's hard for us to receive help, what we really want to understand here is, what is it about this expectation that I feel is either going to be met to my needs or doesn't make sense for what I really want? The other thing is, a lot of the times that we're going to put in the way of this is the fear of disappointment. And this is huge with expectations, right? Our fear of being disappointed by the way in which somebody will do something. I'm going to talk about this more, but this is one of these really big ways that stops us from receiving any help when we're trying to meet different types of expectations. Think about this within relationships. There are some things that my husband does a whole heck of a lot better than I do. There are some things that I do probably better than he does, right? He's probably not going to do the interior design in our house, but he'll probably put something together for me and it'll be so much faster and so much more efficient. And this is how we're balancing and managing that expectation. It's how we're starting to see that we can receive help and support in different ways. Our availability to create space for that allowance is so important in a relationship. Okay, and there was another question that was brought up, and I want to bring this up in the beginning because I feel like this question is relevant to all of my webinars, to all the things I do. And it's one in which, if I wish that like when people booked a package with me, or they even saw me and they saw me for their, a service for me for their loved one, that I have this question answered. I probably should put it on something that I utilize. What is the most important thing for a loved one of a perfectionist to know in order to support them throughout their recovery? In my opinion, because I am not all knowing, I am not, I'm an expert in perfectionism, but I'm not all knowing for everyone. And one of the most important things would be, it is louder in their minds than you've ever heard it, all the time. Whatever a perfectionist is going through, whatever that person, that type A high achiever is going through, it's louder. And it takes a lot of management to be able to step back and really realize how they're going to show up with you, with anybody, with their expectations, They set the highest expectations of themselves constantly. And unfortunately, that is something that is not easily broken within a day or two. And I think anybody that's in watching tonight can also, that identifies as a perfectionist or recovering perfectionist, can agree with that. You are your biggest critic. So my advice for the partners that are watching tonight, have some patience, but also listen. Just listen to some of these pieces. 9 times out of 10, a perfectionist will tell you exactly what they need before they even recognize what they need. So let's move on. We're going to do a little bit of background too on some perfectionistic things, because I think that this is what's going to be really helpful for us to understand expectations and managing the mental load in a way of how we as perfectionists and recovering perfectionists experience these types of expectations. There are 3 domains of perfectionism. And what this basically means is that this is the ways in which we experience perfectionism within our world, right? As a typical perfectionist. This is what research has found. The first one is that of self-oriented. This is best defined as our internal representation of ourselves, right? So what this looks like is I hold myself to a very high expectation to do well when I'm working with a client in therapy, right? Like that's me. Like I hold this really heightened expectation. We have an inability to accept our mistakes and failures on the downside of this self-oriented perfectionism. So this looks like having a super high inner critic, difficulties with confidence. When these events or situations are combined with negative life experiences, it can often lead to depression. This is where the perfectionist will often isolate. If a perfectionist or a person that identifies as a perfectionist is having self-oriented perfectionism, they have these super high expectations and it's like nothing can ever meet them, right? This is when you do a really good job at work or you got an A on an assignment and it doesn't matter because all you're seeing is, I should have done better. I should have got 100%. I should have spent more time studying for this. It's never being able to meet that heightened standard. And this is where perfectionists really struggle interpersonally. It's where a lot of difficulties come up with their own level of self-confidence. The second piece of perfectionism is that of socially prescribed. And this one's super, super, super interesting, especially in regards to relationships. Socially prescribed is the level of perceived responsibility of others, right? So this is how we hold others to an expectation. This can be really, really common for individuals who assume to have high expectations of their partner. So for instance, what's a good example of this? Feeding dogs, right? If your husband or your partner or your loved one feeds the dogs every night, your expectation is that person feeds the dogs every night. Maybe I feed them in the morning. Maybe, that's your job. That socially prescribed expectation, once it's not met, we're left feeling really disappointed and discouraged with the way in which that expectation isn't met. And remember, once that happens, we start to go back into our own selves and start to feel this way of why wasn't this met and why am I now disappointed? It's really difficult for problem solving when we're experiencing socially prescribed perfectionism and difficulties with expectation. It's really difficult to do problem solving because we can't understand why that person isn't maintaining the expectation. This is where we struggle to delegate work. I want you to think about work for a second, right? And there's like this one task that comes up at work and you won't give it to anybody. Why? Typically you have a reason, right? Typically you know why that is, or that person has disappointed you in the past. So this is the understanding of socially prescribed perfectionism. This also relates to other oriented. So this is when we're kind of looking at this other person, and let me clarify something too. Socially prescribed can also relate to large groups of people. Other oriented can be more specified with what we're talking about, right? With that one person. So this time is where the relationship stress really, really increases because what we're doing is we're trying to maintain really high expectations of how that person should show up in our lives. Okay, so let's go on to this next piece. One of the things that I came up with a long time ago was a 4-step process for helping with managing expectations. And I'm going to give you some examples, and then we're going to talk about how this is showing up in your day-to-day lives. The first part of this 4-step process, and I want you to think about an expectation that you hold of yourself. I want you to go personal with this, right? What is the one thing that you hold really high of yourself, that you expect yourself to do very, very well, whether it's been met or not, right? I prefer it not being met, so it can be a little bit of an easier example. But whether it's been met or not, what is the one thing that you expect of yourself to do? And where is that expectation being held? When we understand where expectations are being held, we can really engage with understanding our background on it, right? Maybe you grew up in a home where grades were a requirement, where sports were a requirement, where maintaining the highest, being the best was really, really important. This is very common for perfectionists. If you weren't bringing home all hundreds, you were failing in some way. If you weren't maintaining some type of standard, you weren't doing well in some way. Maybe that even resonates into your relationship that you're experiencing now. Your partner doesn't say, hey, congratulations on doing really well on that. They're like, it was okay. And now every time you're trying to meet that new expectation. So let's go through the 4 steps. The first one that I want you to do, and I'll say it afterwards. Okay. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to detach your worth from the result. Here's where perfectionists get stuck a lot of the times, is that they base their entire worth on the accomplishment and the need to accomplish something heavily, right? So, or not heavily, but perfectly. Let's go with that. When we connect ourselves to the worth of how something works, we're not really spending a lot of time in the process of it. I have a really good example for this. I've been working with an attorney for a really long time. We have a great working relationship. And one of the things that her and I have really had to focus on doing over the last couple of years is detaching her worth from the result of the case, right? So if she works at a firm that is going to pay out a lot of money for somebody based on whatever their needs are, she really cares about how much money is going to be released because that's what's important to her. Does it make a difference in her salary? No. Does it make a difference in that person's life? Maybe, but that's not what her concern is, right? Her concern is what's happening here. Once you can detach your worth from that accomplishment, you're not holding on to that level. And to be honest with you, the attorney is not the person making the decision on the amount of money that's being dispersed, right? So we have to detach from that, because she's not the one deciding and handing out hundreds of dollars to this person. This is really difficult, and I understand this. When we're working a high executive job, when we're working with people, when we're having really strong expectations for the way in which we are trying to maintain high value and show up in that space, it's really hard to detach our worth from that accomplishment all the time. The outcome of what you're trying to achieve is not dependent on your worth. It's just not. Part 2. Be realistic and communicative. I cannot yell this any louder or repeat it, right? The difficulty with expectations a lot of the times is that 1, we're not being realistic, or 2, we're not being communicative. If we do not inform the other side of what we expect when an expectation is set, or what we hope, or what we want to achieve, we're kind of putting ourselves into a corner. And this isn't true all of the time. It can't be. But what this is actually looking at is how can we start to lay this out a little bit more so that we can improve the understanding with each other. Ultimately, the foundation of managing expectations with yourself and with your partners is communicating the needs that you have. My husband and I used to work in this small town, and his office was on one side of the street. My office was on the other side of the street. We left about the same times, but then when we went to leave the office, it would typically be different times. I'd be with patients until, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 7 at night. And sometimes he would stay at the office from like 7 to 9 at night, depending on what was going on, right? Typically in the morning, we'd say, hey, what's your expectation of the day, right? Where do you expect your day to go? What time should we expect to have dinner? Do we have plans for dinner? What does this look like? This check-in is invaluable. Like, this is one of the best things that you and your partner can start implementing ASAP. And it just looks like a 3 to 4 minute check-in of what can we both expect for today. So the other one needs to either show up more, or we need to make different types of plans for what's going on. Adaptations are key for this too. We have to be able to make adjustments as they come. If for whatever reason something goes bananas during your day, and now you're not coming home till 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, we have to be able to make adaptations. And this can look as simple as saying, hey, can you pick up pizza tonight? Because I'm not going to be able to make that cordon bleu that I usually make. I'm going to actually be really late. How much can you adapt to this? Although it may upset the other person with that expectation, that adaptation, that communication, and that being realistic is the key part. It's not going to be perfect, guys. It never is. But it's about you guys creating space for your needs, creating space, right? And recognizing that that mental load can actually be balanced by the two of you so that we're not leading to disappointment. So we're not leading to an argument. So we're not leading to an unrealistic expectation. Number 3, acknowledge that you are your hardest grader. I wonder how many people that are watching this evening really focused on getting high grades when they are in school. One of the things though, right, is that we still hold this expectation of ourselves that we're still being graded. And that's not how our life's typically working. C's get degrees. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't know why I blanked out for a second. It's not that expectation that you're going to get graded on how good your dinner came out. If you guys had pizza versus having healthy chicken and rice that night, it's just not. And we have to detach ourselves from that expectation, from that idea that the thing that we are doing is going to have a grade later on. Sure, this happens with work, right? In some capacities, what we start to notice is that the way we make bonuses, the way we make commission, the way things are produced, that feels like a grade. Sometimes that absolutely can feel like a grade. However, in your interpersonal life, in the boundaries that you are setting, in the ways in which you're communicating, it is not always a direct correlation that you will be graded on that piece. So I really want you to pull away from grading yourself constantly and recognize that you are your hardest grader. Number 4, remember to be present within the moment. And what I mean by this is that oftentimes, and there's a really good question that leads into this, a lot of the times we go really far into that temporal, that time boundary that says, if I didn't meet this expectation, what other expectations am I not going to meet? If I didn't meet that expectation, what does that look like? You got to stay in the present moment with it. You got to recognize that even though every day we're setting these internal and external expectations, especially related in our relationship, especially related to the way that we work and we function, it does not mean that this is the only expectation that exists, and there are going to be adaptations, but being present with that and coming to the understanding that today it didn't go the way that I had wanted it to go is absolutely okay. This is where we create that space to actually have that disappointment, to lean into those really negative feelings that we're feeling and we don't want to feel, to just recognize that it's not always going to work out. I don't, it's really interesting. One of my sister-in-laws called me last night and she finished this book that I was reading. I read it and then I recommended it to her and she started reading it. And she called me last night and she was so disappointed with the ending. And I was glad she read it because I was glad we had that moment together, right? Because I too was disappointed with the ending. And I was like, yeah, didn't meet your expectations. She's like, I can't believe that I read this whole book and that's how it ended. We both created space to have that shared moment of just frustration, right? Could it have ended a different way? Probably. Did it need to end the way that it did, which was really confusing and very unexpected? No, the book's Verity, by the way, if any of you have read the Colleen Hoover book, Verity. So just think of that too, right? Start to recognize that you can create some space. You can be present in the moment with it. You're allowed to have some of those different types of feelings. The more you push these feelings down, the harder they're going to resurface. So if you need to walk away, create some space and be disappointed, that's absolutely okay. We just have to be able to bounce back quickly. Take a drink. Okay, so how annoyed are you? Right? Because now I just gave you a 4-step process and you're just supposed to walk away, right? I'm annoyed for you, right? Because nothing is this easy to just have this in this moment and just walk away. We don't come to these really difficult hardships and these management of expectation and go, I'll just follow Nicole's 4-step process and I'll be all good to go and I'll just walk away. That's not how it works at all. I'm going to bring up a question. It's a little bit of a longer question, but it's really good. And I feel like it needs the context that surrounds it because this relates directly to what we're talking about, well, what I'm talking about. How, as a perfectionist, can we manage the extreme disappointment we feel when our expectations aren't met, particularly by ourselves, so self-oriented perfectionism? For example, in my line of work, I get a lot of no's, but every time I get one, I'm crushed and I'm super hard on myself about it. So then I end up just assuming everything I set out to do will be a no. So that at least I don't have the feeling, I don't have to feel that crushing feeling if it is indeed a no, but that seems wrong. I want to be able to feel excited about potential opportunities and appropriately disappointed if I don't get them, but not crushed. This is where that part 4 comes in, as well as the adaptations that we make. This is really difficult, but what this question is actually talking about too is the confidence of recognizing the things that we are going to operate well with and the things that we're not going to operate well with. There's this saying that I say sometimes with either my therapy or my coaching clients or both, and it's kind of like a hold my beer type moment. And so I work with tons of students over the years, right? And a lot of them would be applying to PhD programs or all these different places. And when they get a no, it would be a crushing experience, right? Why was I good enough? Why didn't I meet the expectation? But a lot of the times, if we kind of put some of this into perspective, we can start to realize maybe that wasn't the school that they're supposed to go to, right? We can take a step back from that for a moment. The difference between being crushed and being disappointed is really about this recognition of who and what is going on for you to assume that every time you're being told no, it means never. This is leading to that all or nothing thinking, which we're going to talk about cognitive distortions. I think it's the last week in February, the second to last week in February. But this is going, okay, it's not just that it's a no, but I'm also so disappointed that I can't even lean into some of these feelings. For this recommendation, I would really lean heavily on step 4, learning how to sit with these while also recognizing that other things could come up, adaptations, right? Making those shifts. So we're going to go through some tips. Okay, I like this quote because I think it relates to exactly the question we were just talking about, but it also relates to that part 4. You always aim for the bullseye, but you don't always hit it. You guys play darts? You ever play 301? Right? So this is where you start with this. You start with 301 points. You got to get down to 0. You got to beat your opponent, right? Every single time you go up to that board, you are typically aiming for bulls. Bulls is 50, right? So every time you are always aiming for bulls, but you don't always hit it. It doesn't mean that you're not trying to meet the expectation. It basically means that you are working towards meeting it every single time, but you're not going to get it every single time. I want you to think about this with athletes, right? Last night we just had the Super Bowl. Athletes have a really difficult time with constantly trying to maintain that expectation. It's their career depends on it, right? If we're starting to recognize, though, that what we need to do is step back some of the times and say, hey, I put a lot of really good effort into it, and find the confidence that exists within that element, it makes a huge shift for how the result is. You always aim for the bulls, but you don't always get it. Knowing it's okay and it's reasonable is about managing your expectations. At least I took the risk. At least I went for the opportunity. At least I tried something. Now let's bring this back to relationships for a second, right? Sometimes our partners do things for us that don't match our expectations. So I'll give you this example. This morning, I was watching the news. I think Martin was doing something, but I was watching the news. And there was a story about flowers on the news. Tomorrow's Valentine's Day, right? Just a reminder, friends. And it was basically saying that the inflation and the cost of flowers has gone up over the years, blah, 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 blah. Great. I like flowers, but I particularly like orchids because orchids I enjoy nourishing and taking care of, and they last longer and they don't just die on my counter within a week or two, right? I'm not constantly trying to sustain them after they've been cut and they've been taken off wherever they are. I like the flowers that like continue to bloom. And I said to Martin, I was like, hey, like I know we're not really doing anything, but if you're going to, Martin's my husband, by the way, if you're going to get me flowers, get me an orchid, even though I really don't need an orchid, right? My expectation is that he doesn't get me anything because we've kind of worked this out. We're okay this year. We don't need to get gifts every holiday, right? But also I was saying to him, if you choose to do something, I would prefer this over this. I would prefer another orchid instead of roses, right? And the reason for that being a lot of the times is because I'm helping to communicate my expectation of it. It's a really small example, but it actually means a lot when we're trying to communicate about our needs with expectations. Okay. When we're working on a goal, we can always have another goal. And a lot of the times the difficulty that happens is that we're not stopping to celebrate the first goal, which is why we constantly set that expectation bar higher and higher and higher. One of the things that I would love for the two of you, you and your partner, or you and your best friend, anybody, like you with any relationship, one of the things I would love for you to do is celebrate the first goal. It's taking time out to acknowledge that first goal. This is really going to help with managing the expectation while also discussing some of these other pieces related to the ways in which activities and needs are being met within the house, right? If we celebrate that first one, and I'm not saying like mop the floors and have a party, like I'm not going that crazy with it, right? I'm just saying, hey, you guys clean the house today, do something for yourself. Hey, you're negotiating these new expectations, find a way to sit in that and be in an enjoyment phase of what that met goal is. Having that stop point is hugely, hugely important for helping to shift the way in which we see expectations and the ones that we're setting up for ourselves. Okay, I'm going to go down a little bit. So I'm going to tell you a story. It was a real eye-opener for me that relates a lot to the way I was brought up, as well as the way in which I now have expectations in my life. So my husband and I go to my father's house in November every year. And one morning, my husband and my stepmom left, and my dad and I were staying at the house, and we were going to make breakfast. And he says to me, it was early. It was like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. And my dad says to me, he goes, honey, do you need something? And my dad and I both my parents and I are very close. My dad is very much a perfectionist in a very different way than my mom is. And my dad is a caregiver. He was always a really, really, he cooked in the house. He did a lot of those different types of tasks. And he says, honey, do you need something? Because I basically grabbed a blanket and came out to the couch and was curled up on the blanket. I was like, no, leave me alone, dude. I'm just trying to sleep for an extra couple of minutes and then I'll get my life together, right? And I said, no, Dad, I'm gonna get a cup of coffee and a piece of toast here in a few minutes. Or I'm just trying to wake up a little bit more before I go and do that. And he's like, okay. My dad waits about 5 minutes and then all of a sudden there's just a piece of toast and my cup of coffee with my dairy-free creamer sitting there. And I'm like, you didn't have to do that. And he was just like, no, I know, but I know you're going to get it anyways. And I look right at him and I'm like, you're the problem. And he's like, I come again. I'm like, you're the problem. You always were right there for me when I was trying to get those needs met. And you always worked before me to have that expectation set. So then sometimes when I tell my husband, hey, can you refill the water? It doesn't mean in 20 minutes. It means I'm actually really thirsty right now. You're getting up to go to the bathroom. Can you refill the water on your way back? Once I noticed this kind of dynamic shift, it was a really big joke between my husband and my father and I, by the way. But once I started to notice this dynamic shift, I started to notice why I personally set those expectations for myself all the time, especially within my relationships. My dad was always thinking a little bit ahead. My dad was doing charcuterie boards before they were cool, right? He would cut up cucumbers and ranch and all these different types of things. He'd be like, here's your snack before dinner, because I know you're going to be hangry and angry with me. So let me set this up for you. A lot of the times in our partnerships, we assume that our partner should know these different types of things that we need. But what happens here is that there's typically a deficit within our communication in the way that we're communicating our actual needs. Sometimes it may even look like we don't totally know what we need. This is very true for a lot of people, especially when you're burnt out, you're frustrated, you're overwhelmed, something along those lines, right? Communicating these needs is the most important facet. Saying that, hey, my expectation is this is how I will get things done. This is how I want it managed. I want to go back to that. Doing check-ins, right, with yourself and your partner and saying, say you're going to a work party. I do this with Martin all the time, right? So we're going out to meet some of his work colleagues for drinks or something and dinner. I say, hey, what's our expectation for like coming home tonight? I'm sure you do this too with your partner in some regard, right? Like, what's our expectation for how late are we staying? Are we going to go to the second bar? Are we going to do some of these different things? You then need to have some type of system where the two of you can communicate about where is that expectation being set, met, or how can we navigate it together? Then you can understand how the two of you show up, and you can know going into it, what are the expectations? I see a question. If we see the need in our partner, should we announce it, or are we just trying to address it? Or just hand the snack first of all. I love that. Okay, if we see the need in our partner, should we announce that we are trying to address it? This is going to be something that's developed upon between the two of you, right? And I think it requires that really significant foundation of how am I going to communicate with this person, but also how does this person feel comfortable receiving this information? If I go to Martin and I'm like, I just expected you to know all these things, he's not going to take that really well. He's going to be like, you're being ridiculous. Like, what? Like, how could you expect me to know all these different things? Over time, we can get better with these adaptations where we don't necessarily have to ask. It shouldn't also be a public service announcement, because that can feel kind of mean, like, hey, I'm calling you out on these types of things. Whereas I would start with just, hey, my expectation looks like this. I'm curious as to what yours looks like, so we can communicate better about how this result could play out, right? How this event could play out. Does that make sense? Did that answer that question? Schedule regular check-ins. Issues become when one of us sets expectations and the other one isn't aware of what that expectation looks like. This is going back to that moment of setting those expectations. I want you to guys think about this mental load for a second, right? Let's go back to the tabs being open. Does your partner know how many tabs you have open regularly? Does your best friend? I know a couple of my best friends, they cannot believe how many things I do in a day, and they don't want my schedule, right? But one of the things that's really helpful a lot of the times is that if they need something, they'll say to me, hey, do you have space today? Do you have emotional availability? This is the exact same system we need to use with our partner. There are going to be days that you're going to be able to show up more, and there are going to be days that you need to show up less. And this communication system is so pivotal for the way in which the two of you interact within your relationship in order to manage new expectations within relationships, in order to communicate your needs appropriately. Because this is what this comes down to, right? Is that at some point in our lives, we felt as though we couldn't ask for our needs, or asking for our needs was too much, which is why we put all of this on ourselves. We put all this mental load on ourselves. If you really think about how many tabs that you have open on a daily basis, how much of that is your partner helping and is supporting you with? And I don't want you to just look over to your partner right now and be like, oh, honey, like, why aren't you helping me? Like, no, that's not the goal. The goal is to find a balanced system that works for the two of you, that you can both agree upon, right? I make this joke, and it's kind of a joke, but it's not totally a joke. I married the guy that does the thing that I absolutely hate, which is math. My husband's in finance. I don't enjoy doing math. Here's the thing though, right? Every week we sit down for 20, 30 minutes. He does it longer, but when we have our like chat about it, it's only a few minutes long because we've been doing it for so many years, right? He does our books. He does everything related to the finances in our lives, which is great because I don't want to participate in that. But what he asks of me is that at the end, he says, hey, do you have a minute? And it's basically this moment of, hey, he did all this work for us just now. I need to sit down with him for a few minutes and hear what the decisions are so that I feel like I'm one collaborating on it. But then two, I'm a part of this, right? Because this is what's helping to manage that expectation in a way that helps me to know what's going on, but not have to do all of it. Same thing. Yesterday, I went through a huge purge. You can't really tell, but I cleaned my entire office. You can't tell from your perspective. I can tell from mine. I cleaned my entire office. I cleaned out the closets. It's my springtime, right? Sometimes what I'm really looking for is not for him to come in and give me an A+ grade on it, but I'm just looking for him to say, hey, like, it looks like you got rid of a lot of stuff. Where should we put those things? Or what's your plan? Where do you want this to go, darling? And just kind of navigate that with me and be like, looks good. You look like you're really happy in your new space that you've created, right? Remember, I will never let anybody interior design my home. It just takes that few minute approach. It just takes that couple second of, hey, this is my expectation. Can you just come look at this closet that I made look all nice? And it's like, beautiful, beautiful. There's another piece here too. And it helps with delegating the tasks related to the mental load. One of the things that I notice a lot of the times with Martin and I is that I will see the end result. And actually my mother-in-law is really good at this too, is that we can see the end results. So her and I will look in the yard and we'll be like, this is kind of what we want. And then as we go, we strategize, like, how is this going to play out? And we just did this because we were doing plants in my backyard. Martin doesn't always see that, right? He doesn't always have that expectation of how it's going to result. Most of the time he's like, how much are the plants? Like, he wants to know what we're going to spend. But one of the things that I have to do in the beginning is I have to give him a little bit of layout, and then I need to give him time to process this. This is a huge asset for you and your partner, right? It's finding that way to create that foundation that says, hey, this is the way in which we're going to be able to bounce back quicker, is that if we can understand each other's needs, understand the desires, understand the outcome, then we can work towards the common goal of whatever we want to get done. We can have plants in the backyard and 2 magnolia trees instead of 1, right? This can look like breaking it down and stepping away and creating space. So a long time ago, we were living in this house. Do you guys know those like collage walls? Like, they'll have like photos and then like some things like decor things hanging up. I wanted one of those. So I collected a bunch of stuff from antique shops and places and home goods and all these different things. And he's like, what are we doing with all these things? I'm like, you'll see. We went to put it up one day and he's like, I don't know how you want to do this with it. And, it's not going to look mathematically correct. It's not going to fit on the wall the right way. I was like, I have an idea. And I took a couple pieces of cardboard and I cut out the cardboard and then I assembled it on the ground. And he's like, I still don't know what we're doing here. And I'm like, well, now that it's assembled on the ground, I'm just going to tack up the cardboard where I want the things. And then we can start making sure that the measurements make sense and make sure that, the dimensions work. As soon as it started to go up, he was like, holy cow, this looks really cool. It's exceeding his expectation, right? But before then, I had to get him on that same page of understanding with me. I had to get him to that trusting moment of saying like, hey, just give me a few minutes to kind of rock with this. I've been playing this out in my head and planning this for 3 months. And I realize I'm springing it on you on Sunday afternoon, right? That negotiation system is so essential for managing expectations within a relationship. It's also really beneficial for when the two of you recognize when your strengths come out in different areas of the mental load. I could go the rest of my life with never washing dishes again. However, I don't mind doing the laundry. If that's the negotiation system that we're operating with, cool. I'll do the laundry. He'll do the dishes. Will that be 100% of the time? No. And I have to be able to make adaptations in order for our life to be a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more easy. Okay, so here's my takeaway for today. 30%. Work on playing out the other person's assumptions, not leaning into the cognitive distortions, but 30%, right? What do you think your partner needs later? What do you think their expectation is for Valentine's Day tomorrow? You should communicate about it tonight if you haven't already, by the way. What do you think that next part is? If we as the partners can start to recognize, if I just increase this by 30%, what does that actually look like? And how does it help my partner in a different way? And this means negotiating that mental load. It means coming up with some different things. Maybe you plan dinner, right? Maybe that's what it looks like to help take that burden off that person for the day. for my perfectionists, for my recovering perfectionists, for all of my beautiful coaching clients that are here tonight, or other therapy clients that are here tonight, lower the expectation by 30%, right? It's not that he's doing it perfectly or she's doing it perfectly. It's that they're trying to show up in a different way, which means they're going to communicate with you more. So lower it 30% so that you can find some adaptation and communication with the way that I exist. I talked a lot longer than I expected to. If you guys want to drop some questions in, I'm just going to take a second. Aim low, avoid disappointment, which is the stark contrast to my recovering perfectionist range, which says aim high. Oh, see, and this is really interesting. How can I get him to understand that my brain, it seems like the opposite of mine. Yeah, so I notice a lot of people say this about expectations, right? Is that if I lower my expectation, then I won't be disappointed. Okay, I get where you're coming from by that. But then when does the expectation ever get to become more for meeting the needs? And yours is aim high, shoot your shot and get as close as you can. They are very different, but at the same time, you're both shooting for the bulls, right? And the biggest understanding that's happening here is, what is the difference if you're both shooting for the bulls for the same goal? And is the actual goal different, right? Because that's what I'm more curious about is, let's say you guys are trying to buy a house, because this is just an easy example to toss out there, right? Do you both want the house? If you're both wanting that house, then you're both aiming at the bulls. So if he's going to aim low and you're going to aim high, guess what? You guys are going to make a perfect match. You're going to hit right in the middle. You're going to get bulls, right? And you're going to get buy a house. But if there's a difficulty with the expectation that's being held, right? So whatever interpersonal problem there may be, what is it that is holding up one side that's different from the expectation on the other side, right? So if my expectation is to walk downstairs tonight and Martin's made, I don't know, tacos in the shape of a heart, it's not. I'm just being ridiculous with my expectation, right? If I'm expecting that, I'm aiming really, really high. His expectation is that we're going to eat something tonight and it'll be something he cooked, right? It's fine that we're coming to that difference with low and high, as long as the goal is the same goal. It doesn't need to be that he sees it every way, every time your way, but something that the two of you can navigate together to make sure that you're meeting the same goal. Does that make sense? You don't want your husband's brain to also be the exact same way as yours. That's what makes the two of you as compatible as it does. If you're the same way, it would be very boring a lot of the times. I hope that's helpful, and don't take that the wrong way. Take it the right way with that. Okay, let me just go through this. Oh, another pro tip that may be really, really helpful, that my husband's actually really liked over the years, and actually a lot of my family enjoys as well, is I've always been a list maker over the last couple of years. It's been more helpful with not doing as many lists. However, if I need something to be done and managed, it is easier to have my expectation written out. Let's just go with a grocery list for a second, right? And Martin makes a joke out of this 90% of the time now, because he's like, if it wasn't on the list, it'd get bought, babe. Like, it just wasn't there, right? If this is another way for the two of you to communicate about the mental load and about the expectations that are trying to be made and met, use this. Use this as a tool. Use it as a communication tool. Sometimes I'll say to him, I'm like, hey, on Saturday, I have to run a bunch of errands. You're welcome to come with me. My expectation is lower in this moment because I don't expect him to take his full Saturday and run to all three of the grocery stores that I prefer, right? That's what I want to do. Is it for the common goal of us and eating certain foods? Yes. But is it something that's absolutely necessary for me to do? No, probably not. I'll say, I'm going to go run these errands. You're welcome to come with me if you want to come with me. Otherwise, if you're going to stay home, would you mind doing these couple little things so that when I come home, I'm not feeling the overwhelm of getting those home tasks done, as well as making sure we got all these different groceries and I maybe stopped at Home Goods on the way back. That little correspondence, that little communication tool can help with managing so much of the expectation and the communication within a relationship. It can help lay that foundation so that the two of you are on the exact same page of what the actual expectation is. If he completes one or two of these different things, and then I get to come home and those 2 or 3 different things, I don't care what else he did for the rest of the day, right? Like it doesn't matter, because those big priorities were kind of were dealt with that day. My husband often says that his brain doesn't think like mine. Great. How do you manage that and not feeling like then everything is your idea and he's following along? Great question. Like he's joining your goal or plan versus having his own thoughts and create the shared vision. Ooh, very cool question, especially related to expectations. I would highly recommend that the two of you look at this in I want you to zoom out. I want you to zoom out from this whole piece of the expectation, right? So one of the things that I think is really helpful, and I utilized this a little bit when I was doing couples counseling, but I think is really, really helpful, is to do a 1-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan with your partner. And honestly, fantasize, right? Like maybe you guys want to build a ranch in Yellowstone. Great. Is that in a 1-year or is that in a 5-year plan? I want you to start paying attention to the way in which both of you enjoy showing up in your life. And this is really tough for perfectionists because we don't want to have too much of an unrealistic expectation, right? Even though we set it high, we don't set it that high. But the goal here is to see what things the two of you both have an interest in that you're both moving towards. And how are you both showing up in that support system, right? A lot of times if we're sharing income, if we're sharing assets, if we're sharing homes, if we're sharing all these different things, a lot of that is built on desire. And those desires are met by the goal of moving towards this next level, this next step. If you're feeling like all you're doing is dumping all of these expectations that you have onto your person, how many of those expectations are actually really important to that person? And ask him, ask them, ask her, ask whoever, right? Ask them. Are these important to you? Does it matter to you if I wash the baseboards once a month? It probably doesn't. So why are you holding that to such a high expectation? If there are certain things that are just non-negotiable for you, cleaning toilets, wiping down counters, cleaning baseboards, if that's non-negotiable for you, and that's your expectation, right? And that's what you're trying to maintain and understand. Does it need to also be theirs? And if not, like if it's not like a bigger thing, like, hey, let's buy a house in the mountains, right? If it's not like a bigger thing related to that, if they're smaller things, what would it look like for you and that person to align on why this is important to you? I know a lot of couples don't like to go to sleep with dirty dishes in the sink, and they want the dishwasher running. They want that like next part of the process. Explain to your partner why that's important to you. Explain to them that you don't like scrubbing dishes in the morning and that you don't like seeing that and that it brings the smell. Explain that expectation a little bit. This is that communication is the foundation, right? If they start to recognize, here's my biggest one, my biggest pet peeve, leaving clothes in the washer overnight, not moving the clothes to the dryer. I make this mistake all the time, right? But it's a big pet peeve that I have for myself as well as for my for my partner. So if we can start to shift, and he knows that I'm frustrated by that, we're going to make mistakes, but just going like, hey, we didn't ruin anything. The towels just smell disgusting now. Let's fix that, right? Then we can start to see where our goals align together. Definition, yeah, super helpful. Thank you. Before we finish, can you repeat the 4 steps so I can write it down? Yeah, absolutely. And I can also drop it in the chat too. I have it written down here. I'll do that at the same time. So number 1 is detach your worth from the result. Here we go. Detach your worth from the result is the difficult task, and I realize that. Sorry, some of my notes are in there too. Be realistic and communicative. Recognize adaptations are often key for our needs. Acknowledge that you're your hardest grader. Remember to be present within the moment. Not everything happens on our schedule or within our desire to make things happen. One of the coolest conversations that I hope you and your partner have after this, and I know I'm right at 8 o'clock, so I want to be really considerate of your time, but I also want to just take that extra minute. One of the things that I hope you and your partner can have a conversation with is understanding the difference between the expectations that you both set. If there are certain things that are really important to you that aren't as important to your partner, it's important that we give value to that notion, to that thing, to that expectation. But if it's not the one thing to you that it is to the other, how can you compromise together to have that common understanding that although it may not be the important thing, there can be alignment within the goal. If my husband wants to wash the truck every weekend, okay, I actually enjoy a clean truck, right? If my goal is to make sure the bathrooms are clean every weekend, okay, I'm sure he likes going into a clean bathroom, right? Those are really small examples for other big concepts that this can relate to, but communicating and understanding what those expectations are and what the mental load is actually looking like for your other partner can be one of the most valuable assets for the two of you to make that alignment together, right? It is probably not important to my husband that I have decor in certain places. Does he love the appearance? Yes, but it's not an important thing to him. It's not something I can convince him into just totally liking. I do research for 3 months to pick out the decor that I want. He did not. Managing that expectation and learning the adaptations that exist with it will help both of you. And sitting down and really going over what are the things on our mental load and how can we help to divide them. One piece that I did bring up, remember how I was telling the story about my dad and how he just knows and he needs that. He just shows up with a piece of toast and coffee for me. The time that lapse in between that is really important to communicate about with your partner. If you expect time and immediacy needs to be met, and that is the expectation that you are holding, it is important that you communicate that. There is something that your partner holds as an expectation for you that relates to time as well. Communicate and understand what that expectation is. Maybe it's moving the dirty laundry in the washer to the dryer. Maybe it's something bigger, right? Maybe there's a bigger thing related to time, paying a bill, something along those lines, dealing with taxes, right? We're in that time of year. Communicate that, understand. Okay. Next week is increasing productivity and managing your schedule. Please feel free to bring your partner. I'm trying to relate all these to relationships and giving examples like that. I hope that you and your partner can have some really good conversations post this. But thank you so much for coming. If anybody has any other questions, please let me know.